Prayer, if you would. Heavenly Father, we're indeed grateful for the rest through the night, for this new day that you've given us the opportunity to see. We pray that you would help us throughout this day to use it as you intend, to bring honor and glory unto thee as we offer praise and adoration to the wonderful opportunities that are afforded us because of the gift of thy Son in our behalf. May we today resolve within ourselves to do thy bidding and that only, and that will teach that message to the lost and dying world in which we live. Be with those of our numbers that are sick, those that are undergoing various therapies or surgeries, and especially with those as well of our number and of our extended families that are suffering the loss of loved ones. Bless them with the things they stand in need of always, in accordance to thy will. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, last Sunday, as a matter of fact, we were concluding chapter 8, and I made mention of the battle plan, and hopefully if you didn't see that battle plan when you were reading chapter 8, then you'll see there was trickery involved. They act like the whole army was coming north under the leadership of Joshua, but in reality, there was 5,000 that's hiding between them and the city of Bethel, and then all of a sudden, once the people in Ai come out and take off running after the Israelite army, and the city is left without any protection whatsoever, then they swooped down on top of them and burned the city to the ground. And and I made the observation that I had read in history of different battle plans that use that same type of tactic. And of course, it's one of those things that's interesting, obviously, but if somebody sees a battle plan that was an inspired battle plan like this one, I wouldn't say, you could say, well, that'll work every time, because that's not going to be the case, because circumstances might be different. But certainly for this situation, then it was highly successful, and thus is going to begin then what we commonly refer to as the Southern Conquest. And as a matter of fact, if you look on your the outline on the very first page that we handed out, down here with Roman numeral number 2, and then letter B there, starting at verse 9, the conquest of southern Canaan. Now, when you take that and then you look to the back page, and of course I'm sorry that it is so small, very, very small, but it does show at the bottom there what amounted to the southern campaign, and also the central, and then the northern campaign. And that's the way that the armies of the Israelites are going to be traveling. And so you can see the specific locations and all of these individual cities that are going to be taken over and all during this particular campaign. And one of the things that at the end of that 8th chapter that we I didn't mention it all, but should have, is that here in verses 32 through 34, we see that Joshua actually makes a copy of the law of Moses. And he reads the law of Moses before the people. So in a primitive setting like this, the motivating factor and the instruction factor, the educational factor, was having to have a knowledge of God's will. And so that took prominence so many times. Whenever there was a difficulty to come, or there was a recovery from some particular predicament they've had to live through or whatever, then always return to what God says, and what God's word instructed is always the right place to go. And that's certainly what they need to realize right here. And of course they had to be constantly reminded of that. You would think after they were able to take the city of Jericho and then ran into some problems with the city of Ai, then you would have thought that took care of them for good, as far as them not paying attention to what they're doing and being real careful. But lo and behold, when you get to chapter 9, you would have to say that somebody is dropping the ball here too. And I say somebody's dropping the ball here, maybe you could call it the people, because of their success, and especially since they just got through with a rebound from the problem that resulted because of Achan. then maybe they've got a little bit too comfortable in themselves and are sort of taking things for granted. So we call that sometimes complacency, okay? And that may be too strong of a word to describe what happens here, but what ends up happening, and it's detailed here in this chapter, should never happen. It shouldn't have read this way, but it did. And so here we have inspiration recording for us how that people who shouldn't be are oftentimes the most gullible ones to believe a lie, sadly. Now, we're going to see that, and I think I've described this situation here with the Gibeonites before as an Oscar-winning performance, because that's exactly what it is. Because they really show themselves to be something that they certainly are not. And so that's why we say, at least I say, that there's the danger of being complacent, and that's what happened right here too. All right, we begin reading chapter 9, and then you see that there's turmoil, and I think our questions actually address that. Before we do that, before we look at number 1, I want us to read the first few verses here, okay? And it came to pass when all the kings that were on this side of Jordan, in the hills and in the valleys, and all the coast of the great sea over against Lebanon, the Hittite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and the Jebusite, heard thereof, they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. Now that one accord was a Honda, obviously. No, it wasn't a Honda, no. Now, what does that mean? They were united, okay? So they have heard of the exploits that have just recently happened under the leadership of Joshua and the army of the Israelites. And so now they're saying, we got to form some type of confederacy, some type of association here, so that we'll be able to stand up against these crazy lunatics that have escaped from Egypt 40 years ago, and here they are coming into our country to wipe us out. We got to do something about this. So let's get together. Let's form this confederacy, and we'll help each other. What amazes me when you read through this, I mean, it reads like today in the world today. You've got to help this person because you don't want that person to win, and they've got to help that person, and we need to help those people, and if we help those people and those people on the other side, then that same stuff. Except here, you have a divine injunction as to exterminate the heathen that lives in the land, okay? Whether they pride themselves in being able to get together and all work under one general, I sort of doubt that. What do you think? Remember, even when you think back to World War II, a lot of the bickering and fighting was over who's the general who's going to get to lead the particular tank brigade. Is it going to be the Englishman, or is it going to be the American? Who's it going to be? So they would be bickering. But here, there's at least these 5 city-states and these 5 kings, and they're called kings because they're the chief officer of these various cities, and so they are coming up with a plan in order to not be exterminated, like they are already aware that Jericho and Ai have been, okay? And they gather together to fight with one accord. They are united. Now here's a situation in which when you hear people talk about the great need and desire for unity, well, here you got it. Here's an example. They're all out to accomplish the same thing, aren't they? Yeah. And they're all going to fight against a common enemy, yeah. And so God's going to bless them, right? Because they're united. No, it's very opposite. It's like the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. They all spoke the same thing. There was no division among them. They were perfectly joined together in the same mind, the same judgment. And God said, I'm going to mess this up because they're not doing what I told them to do. And he confounded their languages. Were they united? Well, yeah. So there has to be something that is more important than unity. Better believe it. The truth fits in there somewhere, don't you think? when there's unity based on truth, then that's the only unity that's worth having. Anything else is just going along, get along, you know. If truth does not reign supreme, regardless of whether nobody in the whole wide world believes it, it's still going to be the truth. People don't accept it, that's ultimately their problem. That's their prerogative. They are free moral agents, they can reject it. But if you reject the truth, then you've cut yourself off from the very thing that will save you initially and keep you saved as well and prepare you for heaven. So unity has to be based upon the truth. And while these guys were united, they were in fact united against God's plan. How successful you think they're going to be doing that? Now sadly, in our day and age, we have people that sit in the same position in their unity against God's plan, but it may not be truly revealed until Judgment Day. But it will be revealed. It will be exposed. And then everybody will see clearly what they could have saw clearly way back here if they just had their eyes open. Because the truth doesn't change. It's the same. Now notice number 3, and this is where the question, I'll let y'all answer the question as to what plan they devised, and then and maybe you'll cover everything that I want to say about that, and I won't have to say nothing, but there's a whole lot here that I really think is amazing. What did they do?
They pretended they were from a far country.
They pretended that they had been traveling for weeks, maybe even months. And how did they pull that off? Did they just say it? All right. See, it wasn't just that they said it, which of course was a lie, you know. And the thing is, why would there be any type of need to do any acting like that anyhow? Why would they think they needed to act like they were from a long way off? All right. There was clear instruction given all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy. You cannot, it's not that you cannot make a league with, it's not that you cannot join forces with other countries and other peoples, but you can't to somebody close around here in Palestine. Can't do it. Because that would be, and here again, why is Putin so mad about Ukraine? Because the United States has promised forever they're not going to be a part of the, what do you call it? Who? No, they're not going to be a part of the, what? NATO. They're not going to be a part of NATO. Well, that's a lie. That's not true. Because they're being treated just like they are. Our stuff is over there being used right now. Our Patriot missiles are being used right now. Patriot missiles did not originate in the Ukraine. So here you've got one country butted up against another country. Wouldn't be very smart if you're trying to overcome the next door country to go into contract with them, would it? Well, of course not. Neither is that the case here. Now, somehow, then the Gibeonites knew about this restriction. They knew that the children of Israel could not make a league with them, could not go in cahoots with them if they were, in fact, a near peoples. But that's exactly what they are. They're from Gibeah. Remember when we sometimes use the example of the traveling Levite in Judges 19, I think, who is trying to get to a tribe by nighttime so he can go into one of the cities of the tribes of his kinsmen for the night. And where does he make his way to? Gibeah. Because Gibeah happens to be in what was allotted then to the tribe of Benjamin. And so he thinks that he's home free, you know, when he gets there to some genuine Israelites. And then, of course, they abuse his poor old concubine all night long. She dies. So that didn't turn out the way he wanted to. So here's Gibeah that's in close proximity to them. And so they've come up with this award-winning pretense as if they're from afar off. What else did they do so that their cover would not be blown? Some little specific things.
The clothes were all torn, and the sandals were worn out. Something about the donkeys.
They all looked like they'd been traveling from afar, for sure. And of course it wasn't. It was only a few miles from where they actually lived. And when it came to the conversation that they were having as well, then they claimed that all they knew about these people was what? What did the Gibeonites say? We only know about y'all because of Egypt and what you did on the other side of the Jordan River and fighting against the kings over there. So that means that in their back door, Jericho and Ai were destroyed, and they didn't know anything about that. Well, of course, they couldn't know anything about that if they were from a long way off and they've been traveling all this time, see. But that's the very reason why they came up with this plan, is because they did live real close. Now, what did they say when they offered themselves over to be in a contract relationship with the children of Israel? They said, we'll be what? We'll just be servants. You know, that's all we want. We don't want to be top dogs in here. We don't want to come in here and start shaking the boat or anything. No, we'll just be your servants. And the idea is, of course, for them, and here's a discussion that I've thought about and have never thought about it long enough to come to an obvious conclusion, but is it better to be a live dog or a slave dog? You know, wouldn't like neither one of them, obviously. But at least if they're alive, they're not dead, even though they're slaves. Okay, so that seems to be their reasoning, which at some junctures obviously would be preferable. You know, if you wanted to escape, just like poor old Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, you know, when he said, woe is me, I'm the only one left, I wish I'd go ahead and die. Well, if he'd have really meant that, all he had to do was go back and let Jezebel take his head off. That's all he had to do. So he was just feeling sorry for himself at the predicament. And he got to live a little longer too, obviously. So that's the being free and yet being servants. And of course, in verse 21 here, it says that they were hewers of wood and drawers of water. Okay, so there's something that needs to be done, and here are people who can actually do that. Now, notice verse 14. How did this happen? Notice how verse 14 tells it. And the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. Now that's pretty significant here. Because if they had, then if they'd have said, are these guys really who they're making out to be? Are they really from a long way off? If they had asked for consultation with God, God could have possibly informed them, man, this has been a real acting job that's convinced y'all, but in reality, no, these people from right here, they're just not telling you the truth. They're trying to make this agreement with you so they won't be killed. So if they had petitioned God's answer in the matter, which of course they may have, that's why I used the word complacency to begin with. Maybe they thought that they could take it from here. You know, we don't have to be concerned with the little small things that we do, but yet obviously right here they needed to, although it does work out good for the Gibeonites, and the children of Israel they abide by the decision that was made, even though the decision was made deceptively. It still holds. Have you ever been in a business venture that you thought was sort of similar to that? Have you ever bought a used car? You know, there's a whole lot of situations in which certain information is provided and certain information is not provided, which after you look back on it, you realize you were hoodwinked. You know, it seemed like to me every time I trade cars, I feel like that. Feel like a big sucker who walks into the car lot, you know, on a cartoon or something. Let's stick it to this knucklehead. He don't know nothing. But so that in fact does happen. All right, what's the next question? I need to do a better job of keeping my stuff put together. Well, of course, what mistake? I just answered that. The mistake is they did not ask God, and what did the Israelites do to the Gibeonites? All right, so here was their job, which allowed them to live, as they were working as servants under the leadership of, under the headship of the children of Israel, for sure. And of course, as you read there, beginning at verse 10, or excuse me, as it goes over into chapter 10, if you look there in verse 2, they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and the men thereof were mighty. They says, oh man, we have made a terrible mistake. And of course, that was their fault. That was their fault. And so all these kings are then mentioned in verse 3, and the obligation that Joshua feels, of course, begins in verse 6. The men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, saying, slack not thy hand from thy servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. So here they are fixing to be attacked by the conglomerate enemies that have been formed to protect themselves, and now they're fixing to jump on poor little old Gibeah, which has more people living in it than Ai. Okay, so it's between the size of Ai and Jericho for sure. And so what's Joshua going to do? What's the right thing to do? You made a contract, you got to keep it. You made a decision based upon false testimony. Now, if we had a lawyer today, then he'd figure out a way to get out of it. I guarantee you that. You know, did you sign anything? You know, have you got a paper trail anywhere? Did you put it on Facebook? You know, and if you've got all that evidence there, then it can be brought up against you unless well, nothing. I ain't gonna say it. Shouldn't have even thought it. Pardon me. FBI. If they've got it, we may not ever see it. And so they take the position that they're going to take care of these people, and rightfully so. And then one of those supernatural events that is sort of hard for people to swallow who have a hard time believing the first verse of the Bible. Okay. And what is that transpires here that is outside of normal? All right, so you got Joshua's long day, the long day. And there's a number of different explanations that have been given. But of all the explanations, the one that is without a doubt true and can't be wrong is that the Lord did it. And it was Moses' job to do the mopping up afterwards, but it was God that extended the day. And so here's some of the explanations that's been given. A total eclipse. All right? That's, for some reason, that's an explanation. There's others that say that's a poetical interpretation, which would mean what? It wasn't really a long day. It just seemed like a long day. Have you ever had any of them? And you didn't even ask God to extend the day, but it seems like it just keeps on and on and on. Was there any miraculous element involved in that? No, no. So, and that's one so-called explanation. And then the third explanation is the prolongation of light. And it says that and of course, necessary for this to be so, then there's a number of things that had to occur too, supposedly. The Earth's rotation had to slow down. Earth could have tilted. The jet propulsion by volcanoes all on one side of the Earth caused it to slow down. Now, I actually heard that on the educational channel one time, that if all the volcanoes on one side of the planet blew at the same time, then that would keep the Earth from going. You know, that's sort of cartoon-like, ain't it? But that's the so-called explanation, a completely natural explanation for this phenomenon. All the earthquakes erupting at the same time. Where's the button you push, you know, to make all these volcanoes in this certain vicinity act and the other ones not act? But just so happened. I mean, you talk about coincidence, you know. I mean, it's hard. You see all these coincidences throughout the Bible. Who would ever thought that Joseph would be down there? I mean, that's just, what luck? No, that's not what it is. It's God that did. That's it. Exactly. Exactly. And the thing is, you know, I've heard here recently, not until here recently, something about change in poles, you know. And I'm not exactly sure what they claim that is, but they claim that something like that, there's evidence of that supposedly within the Earth's mantle that happened at one time, which just meant that, you know, the tilt was a little bit different, and the heat was a little bit different, and the cold was a little bit different, or maybe a whole lot. But anyhow, when God spoke the universe into existence, obviously he can do anything he wants to with what he spoke into existence. And the anti-supernatural bias cuts a person off not just from the truth that's in the Bible, but it cuts one off from the God who gave us the Bible to begin with. That's the bad thing. Oh, yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And so with this extra time, what was Joshua's attitude? He said, oh, we got all this extra time. We'll take a longer break this afternoon and eat our lunches. No. He used that extra time to actually persuade the enemy to give up and pursue the enemy till they gave up. And 5 kings, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. I want to answer these questions before. What happened to the 5 kings then? They come to a bad end. Okay. And they put. Killed them. And then end up, of course, they take them down. Yeah, hung them on a tree and then ended up putting them back in the cave, evidently, and then put a stone over the cave so they're buried there. Of the writing of this account. You know, and that's one of the things when you're reading, when it says until this day, then that seems to indicate that the one that's doing the writing is saying, as he's writing in hindsight of what happened previously, then there's been some time that's taken place since then, and they're still there now. You know, their bodies have not been recovered by family members or somebody that happened not be at home during that period of time, and so you see the active participation in the one that's doing the writing, which of course is a little bit of a distinction between inspiration and revelation. If something has to be revealed to you, like the whole book of Genesis was a revelation to Moses, who wrote by inspiration, but the events that he was a participant in, it didn't have to be revealed to him because he saw it. He was there. You know, he experienced it. And what inspiration did then is made sure that that which was recorded was accurate so that people could base their decisions upon that particular evidence that was true. And God ensured that to be the case. It wasn't left up to those inspired men. All right. Was Joshua, in your estimation, successful in the rest of this southern campaign? I'd say he certainly was. And look again at that picture or the map in the back and see all those cities that had to be defeated. What did I do with it? And of course, again, I'm sorry there's so little. So you got all the way down through here, and if it was, you see up in the top left-hand corner, you got boxed in the areas in which the fighting is being done. And one of the things to keep in mind too is that during these ventures with Joshua being the head of the Israelite army, then he is not he's not like going all the way as far as he could go in destroying the enemies, because ultimately it's going to be left up to the individual tribes to do that. And so what he's doing is breaking the confederacies like these kings here, these 5 kings, and he's doing all the hard work with the whole army. And then it will be possible then, once the land is divided among the tribes, then each tribe has the responsibility of doing what we'd call the mopping up work. And that's where the failure sets in, obviously. If it had been the job of Joshua and the army to whoop everybody, then that would have, no telling how long that would have took. You know, it'd been sort of like if the decision had been made in the South to go into guerrilla warfare, you know, how much longer would the Civil War lasted, you know, saw all that. But each individual tribe had plenty of capabilities of doing what God had commissioned not only the army as a whole to do, but the individual tribes to do as well. And we'll see how well that went as we go on further in this study for sure. All right, let's go to chapter 11. And here's a king of Hazor by the name of Jabin. And so what does he do? Well, he comes up with him a plan too, that he can come up with a confederacy to defend himself. And he's going to be able to, thinks he's going to be able to control his destiny, just like, so it won't happen to him like it's happened to the southern kingdom. And when you see that picture there, then you can see where that is located. And this is not a large battleground by any stretch of the imagination. So these people are tightly put in here. But you can see when he starts to go into the central campaign and work his way north, of course, and that's how he's going to be following the situation here. And so if we were concerning the army, that's the question number, what's the next question? Top of page number 6.
What happened by the waters of
Merrill.
So Joshua came and all the people war with him against them by the waters of Merom suddenly. And it fell upon them. He made contact with them in a really quick, surprising way, I believe.
Yeah. And you got, of course, you got the particular places where the battle is going to take place, the people that are involved in it. And when they all got there, and Joshua said, don't be fearful. Tomorrow we're going to win this battle just like we've done the other ones. But notice what he tells them to do in verse 6. He said, I will deliver them up, all slain before Israel. Thou shalt, how you say that word? H-O-U-G-H. I always, but the idea is hawk, ain't it? I think that's the idea. It's hamstringing the horses, I know that. Whatever the one word is for hamstringing, that's not hamstringing. Now, what's the purpose of doing that? They're not going to be able to be battle horses anymore. Now, you can use them to plow, or your grandkids might ride on its back. But as far as it being a horse that's going to be good in battle again, then it's not going to be able to do that. So they're going to, and there's numerous times in which even God instructed the children of Israel to do that to their own horses so that they would know they were not being victorious because of how great their horses were. They were being victorious because they were doing God's bidding. And so they start relying on themselves instead of relying on God, and then that's where trouble comes in. That's the whole picture of the book of Judges for sure. And of course, preliminary indications would go that way as well. Anytime someone would think that their great ability is what caused great things to happen rather than simply being a faithful servant in the army of the Lord, for sure. All right, number 2. No, it's not. I'm on the wrong page again. What happened to the city of Hazor? So, the total destruction that results in God's successful leadership with Joshua in tow, and all these, the spoils of the city are being taken, the city's being destroyed utterly. So highly successful ventures are continuing on just as God had promised it would be the case. Regardless of how much that they join together as a fighting force against him, they're not going to be able to be successful at all. There are none of the, notice verse 22, there are none of the Ananites left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza and in Gath and in Ashdod there remained. Now, that means that while they did not exterminate everybody, then even when the tribes were given their individual territories and were given the territories with a specific responsibility to wipe out the rest of the inhabitants, they didn't. Some did, but most didn't. And their attitude, and you see this later on as well, is their attitude was sort of like, if we kill them, we're not going to be able to make anything off of them. Why don't we just let them stay here and we'll tax them to live in our land, and we'll make some money off of them, and we won't have to do any dirty work like killing them or anything. We'll just peacefully coexist. Well, that sounded pretty good, didn't it? Well, what did God say about that? He said, don't do that. And he said it because, and he told them specifically, you'll end up having half-heathen grandkids. Because you guys are going to look at them girls, and your girls are going to look at them guys, and they're going to end up intermarrying. And then what are you going to do? Then you're going to have Jezebel as kinfolk. Who wants Jezebel as kinfolk? Well, so that ends up what happens. Is there, instead of, well, I don't see how this could be such a problem. You were given specific instruction as to what to do, because he does know what the end result's going to be when you don't do what he says do. He knows that. And probably you could reason to that position too, if you just thought about it. You got to be careful and do God's bidding. Yeah, that name comes up often, for sure. You know, I've seen, and I've not done any research, but I've seen little snippets of supposedly giant skeletons that have been uncovered in different places, you know. Of course, I've seen supposedly a giant hog that weighed 2,000 pounds too, that turned out to not be hardly that big. You know, it's big, but not that big. Hard to document. Of course, you know, we got some. If somebody uncovered the bones of some of these NBA players today, they'd say we got giants in the land for sure. Yeah. Yeah, she's huge. All right, we will start right here, Lord willing, next Wednesday evening. In the middle of chapter 11.